The 2026 General Motors triplets, the Buick Enclave, the GMC Acadia, and the Chevy Traverse are easily the most family-friendly mid to large SUVs in America. If you don't want a minivan or you can't afford a full-size SUV, you might want to check out one of this trio instead, because on the inside, it's actually bigger in some dimensions than a Chevy Tahoe, but the price tag, that's quite a bit lower. So how affordable are we talking here? Well, the Traverse is logically the least expensive at $42,695 starting, including destination. Then we have the Acadia at $45,595. Then we have the Buick Enclave, which starts at $48,095. And as equipped here, $66,510. That is notably less expensive than body-on-frame full-size SUVs, even though we have space on the inside that's actually pretty similar. And it's also less expensive, generally speaking, than the new Toyota Grand Highlander. This trio is a little bit more expensive than the Hyundai Palisade, but as we're going to be talking about in this video, it is actually bigger on the inside in some really key ways. Styling is the main reason you choose one of the triplets over the other. Do you like the truckier styling in the Traverse or the Acadia, or do you prefer the more elegant styling that we find over here in the Enclave? I have to admit, I prefer the Acadia as far as the styling goes, but this design has grown on me a little bit. It just sort of looks like the rest of the styling language from the other Buicks has been stretched to its absolute limits on this front end. It looks pretty hungry there as well. We have the divorced headlamp treatment here, full LEDs of course, with the turn signal and daytime running light integrated into the same module. It sort of blinks and fades on and off. Now, the Buick, this is obviously the most expensive and the most premium version of this triplet set because we don't have a Cadillac XT6 going forward. Looks like that's going to be discontinued. Formerly, it rode on the same platform and was related to the other, so they were actually quadruplets, but this has the duty of not just competing with the Acura MDX, but also the Lexus TX, something like the Infiniti QX60, although it is roomier than all of those put together. The main reason the GM triplets are so family-friendly is because they're all big. The Acadia is the shortest at 204 inches from tip to tail. This is the longest at 207.6, but on the inside, they're identical. Same cargo figures, same headroom and legroom figures by and large. The difference on the outside is just styling and the bumpers. But that puts these three SUVs in kind of a different subcategory where we really only find the Grand Highlander these days. Yes, you do find some options that are long, like a Grand Cherokee L, but it's not big on the inside. And that's because this is a front-wheel drive based crossover, basically, not a full-size body-on-frame SUV, so you'll notice that the hood is significantly shorter than something like a Tahoe or a Suburban, and that's how we get Tahoe or almost Suburban-like interior room in some dimensions in a package that's a little bit smaller. But this is clearly bigger than a regular Highlander or a Pilot or any of that mid-size category. So again, kind of mid-large. I don't know, let me know what you would call it down there. This is about the same size as a Toyota Sequoia and a Nissan Armada, but on the inside, it is significantly bigger. Out back, obviously, styling is the biggest differentiation between the triplets, although I kind of wish in the Buick that maybe they had tucked that wiper up under the spoiler to help hide it and clean off the look in the back. I do like these full-width LED taillights, and they stick out a little bit from the back. Back here, we have the tow hitch receiver under that little door. We have a 2-inch receiver and a 7-pin wiring harness, and again, you can tow up to 5,000 pounds. Every member of the platform uses the same engine under the hood. It's a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder turbo, producing 328 horsepower, 326 pound-feet of torque. That compares very favorably versus the Grand Highlander's 2.4-liter turbo, which produces just 265 horsepower. Fuel economy comes in between 21 and 23 miles per gallon, depending on whether you choose front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, and it's the same fuel economy number across the lineup in the GMC, the Chevy, and the Buick. Towing capacity is also identical at 5,000 pounds. Towing capacity is clearly one reason you would want to choose the Tahoe or Suburban over this, because those will tow considerably more weight because of their rear-wheel drive design. And speaking of rear-wheel drive design, this engine is actually based off of the 2.7-liter turbo we find in the Silverado and the Sierra pickup trucks. A lot of folks have expressed concern about maybe the durability or longevity of a turbocharged engine in a vehicle that's this size, but I would remind them that the 2.7-liter turbo in the Sierra and the Silverado are actually powering heavier vehicles with significantly more towing, hauling, and off-road capability as well. Now, I do think the more genuine concern in this lineup is that the Buick is supposed to be more premium, and it has the same engine that we find in the Chevy. I could have hoped for a bit more power or a bit more refinement, because this engine, it's not as rough as the one that we find in the Grand Highlander, but it's not as smooth as the V6s that we do find in the hybrid system in the Lexus TX. And of course, there is no hybrid system under this hood at all. And how exactly does it sound? Well, check it out. Front seat comfort is definitely good in the Buick Enclave, but it's not appreciably different than the Chevy Traverse or the Acadia. It's the same basic seat design. We have the available massage in this seat. It's activated via a button down here, but it's a pretty simplistic mechanism. It's just inflating and deflating the lumbar support airbags there. On the other hand, we have a powered memory link tilt telescopic steering column, which is something that we don't find in all of the competition, even if we're talking about some of the more expensive options. On the other hand, you will find a more comfortable and more adjustable seat in something like the Hyundai Palisade, at least for my body shape, and it's certainly more adjustable than this. On the other hand, versus some of those options like Grand Highlander and Palisade, we have a four-way adjustable lumbar support setup in the front passenger seat, making it about as comfortable as the driver's seat. And that's not something we find in most of the competition outside the luxury segment. Just know that this is not really a luxury vehicle, it's more of a premium vehicle, and that's why we find this interesting crossroads of features. On the other hand, the front passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat, including that massage function, and that's something that we don't find in a lot of the competition. The roominess of the interior starts to show when you hop in the second row. I'm 6 feet tall, 180 pounds, and check out how much room I have behind myself with that front seat adjusted for me comfortably. We also get seats that are thicker than some of the competition if that's something that you're interested in, and a generous amount of headroom back here, even though we have the panoramic moonroof. The Acadia, Traverse, and Enclave all get 117.9 inches of combined legroom, and the difference between this and something like a Grand Highlander and a Palisade is going to start showing because the third row in this does not slide, so you always get nearly 118 inches of combined legroom. But you'll only find those lofty legroom figures in Palisade and Grand Highlander if that third row is shifted all the way back, at which point you wouldn't have as much cargo capacity left. We also find a nifty family-friendly feature here in the second row seat that tilts and slides forward like this, allowing you to leave a forward-facing child seat latch anchored into place for easy access to the third row. That's definitely a convenient touch. On the other hand, if you're cross-shopping something like this against a minivan like an Odyssey, a Pacifica, or a Sienna, you should know that we don't have a flat floor back here, so every row tiers further up. My knees are not exactly in my chest, but we have a pretty decent hump between these second row seats, and the floorboards are definitely still higher off the ground than up front. Back in the mother-in-law row, the floorboards are yet higher. They're about 2 inches higher than the second row's floor, but my knees are not stuck in my chest. And if we were to compare this to a Grand Highlander or a Palisade, you'd notice that the seat bottom cushion is a little bit higher off the ground, making it a bit more comfortable for adults. But we still don't find as much room in here as you find in some of those big 3-row full-size SUVs. If I put that seat all the way back, I can tuck my feet just barely, my 2 size 11s just barely under this seat, and my knees are kind of touching the seat back. But this second row passenger could logically move their seat a little further forward, give me some extra room in the back. And combined, we definitely have more room in here than we find in the Palisade. In our new interior measurement system, where we're actually measuring these things in person from seat back, we found about 3 inches or so more room in here than in that new Palisade. We also have a wider interior, so the second row and the third row are both wider than average. That's what helps make 3 across the back a little bit more comfortable. Not ideal, but still more comfortable than the competition. On the other hand, we don't have any child seat anchors back here in the third row, and that is a bit surprising. We also have a shoulder belt that comes out of the ceiling rather than out of the seat back itself, which means if you do want to flip and fold these seats and make use of all that storage room, you have to manually undock that and then stick it up here in its little clip, and then just sort of pray that it doesn't rattle around like we all know it probably will. Like the GMC and the Chevy, we find 23.6 cubic feet of cargo capacity behind this power hatch, and that allows this to swallow 4 24-inch roller bags. This is quite simply the best score in this segment. If you take a look at the new Hyundai Palisade, it could do this, but you have to move the third row forward, and then you'd lose a lot of legroom. It would actually be about the same size on the inside as some of the much smaller entries in this segment. What's interesting, though, is that we had this the same week that we have the Palisade, and the difference is actually relatively small. It's only a few cubic feet, and it's really only about 3 to 4 inches length distance between the hatch and the third row seat backs that allow this to happen. But those inches are critical, and it means the difference between having nearly 120 inches of combined legroom on the inside and the ability to put 4 of these big roller bags behind the third row. If you pack lightly, a family of 6 could easily go for a weekend away with 4 of these bags back here, maybe some extra child things. And under this load floor, you can even put a slimmer 22-inch roller bag, the kind that you can carry on to a domestic flight. And there's even a spare tire further down the rabbit hole. More impressive than that, if you're simply worried about bench seat rearward, you can stick 12 24-inch roller bags between the hatch and that second row seat. So you can still seat 4 people and have 12 big roller bags for your journey away. I'm not normally a fan of power folding third row seats. I think they move too slowly in general, but GM does seem to have fixed that in this trio because these seats move surprisingly quickly. Now let's check out the inside. We have Travis up front here demonstrating the headroom and that big panoramic moonroof that extends to just about the second row passengers' heads. How do you find that seat comfort?
The seat up here is great. There's lots of adjustability. The space up here is nice and open. And like I said, I have lots of headroom.
Yep, and the one big change I would say between Traverse and Acadia and Enclave is the dashboard styling. I think that's the biggest change between this trio. This one has, I'm not sure whether it's my least favorite or middle choice, but this infotainment system is still cool, just not as cool as the others, I think.
Right. I like the screen design, but I don't like how little we're using of the screen. We've got your CarPlay up here, and it's only utilizing 70% when if this was more squared out, it could be a whole lot more.
Basically, the software is the same between the Chevy, the GMC, and the Buick. The Chevy has the biggest screen. It's an over 17-inch ginormous screen in the dashboard, horizontal aspect ratio. CarPlay is going to be almost 3 times bigger on that screen. It's really, really big. In the Acadia, it has a 15-inch screen, and they've kind of turned it sideways right there in the instrument cluster. Same software. Here, we actually get a single screen, and that's what's kind of cool, but expensive. So we actually get less screen real estate in here than we get in the Chevy, but we have a much more expensive and elegant looking screen. It reminds me of what we see in some of the Hyundai products, only without that big black bar, because those don't use one screen, they use 2. Now, Travis, I think one thing that does redeem this screen is that we have the full CarPlay integration, which gives us the 2-screen mapping. So that map is actually being driven by Apple CarPlay, and it does give us that ability to use more of the screen, I guess.
That's a big plus because obviously navigation is one of the first things you need and look for, and having a bigger version of it is a huge plus. And that means over here you can do things basically just like your music or your podcast, but it still leaves all this open space out here. And this, as you said, is controlled by your phone, and there aren't a whole lot of options. I almost wish it didn't use your phones and it matched the rest of the screen so it blended in with the interior just a little bit more.
And the native mapping, of course, is going to use that eccentrically shaped screen out there, that sort of Dame Edna glass look there. Now, this look on the instrument cluster, I'm not the biggest fan of. I think Buick has tried to go too simple with some of their displays. I think the steering wheel is pretty attractive, though. It's nice and chunky. It's round, so it's not square or oblong or weird. No weird sport grips or anything like that. Do love me some sport grips, but not everybody's a fan. Lots of buttons, and of course, Super Cruise.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing here on the steering wheel is actually the chrome accents or the silver accents you find throughout the interior. It really does spruce this thing up. The only takeaway, honestly, is going to be the plastic there at the top, but that is for Super Cruise, and that is totally worth it.
Yeah, what's not as worth it is that we have a lot of shiny black, piano black plastic going on here. And I don't know anybody that said, you know what, I want my car to look like a Steinway showroom. I'm not sure who asked for that.
No, but this is a nice floating center console, so you do have space underneath of it, and that is part of an elegant design. And again, some accenting colors here that go well with the black plastic while it's still nice, shiny, and unscratched.
And the dashboard, I think they did a really good job with, especially in the lighter colors. There's sort of an ivory and blue interior option that I think is really fantastic. How the perforations in this imitation leather sort of fade from one section to the other. We also find that on the door panels, this imitation metallic strip in the dash, injection molded upper section, and the imitation wood on the doors is actually pretty believable. And the speaker grills, even though they're plastic, they do have a nice metallic look to them, both up there on the A-pillar and on the doors.
Even there, the door handle is shaped and designed to look like it's really part of this interior, not just a functional piece.
Yeah, again, sort of goes with those horn-rimmed glasses kind of theme there. And then, of course, we have the head-up display just on top of that. Moving over to the center console with your arm there, show us what's inside.
So we've got a decent amount of storage, but it's more deep than it is expansive. So you have to be a little bit careful about what it is you want to go ahead and put in here, but not much going on. So you won't find any power, but there is a light, and then obviously the container you can go ahead and swap out for multi-tiered level storage.
And the other thing that I like is that we have cup holders for the second row right here in the middle, not in the doors, because yesterday you put a can in the Hyundai Palisades door and I almost had a heart attack.
Thank goodness the can was already empty.
Yes, because the one problem with those door-mounted cup holders is, of course, when the kids close the doors, are they going to remember that there might be a soda in that door?
Chances are slim.
All right, let's get this out on the road. The first thing you'll notice is a little bit of front wheel peel, even though we are in the all-wheel drive model. And that is because of something that GM does that almost nobody else does, which is you can turn all-wheel drive on and off.
Yeah, and also they do crank this thing quite a bit. There's a lot of power under the hood. I think maybe being at that angle helped a little bit of weight transfer, but not a lot of these are going to be doing that, especially not with a big burly V8 under the hood.
Yeah, not without one, I should say.
Yes.
But 0 to 60 is actually pretty decent here. This one went 0 to 60 7.3 seconds in our testing. That is just a little bit slower than the Traverse at 7.1 seconds last time we tested it. But remember, this is the biggest and heaviest of the trio.
Yeah, makes sense.
Probably also explains why the 60-0 stopping distance was a little bit longer than the others, 124 feet here versus the Traverse. Of course, that Traverse was the RS trim, which is the slightly sportier tire and wheel package going on there, 116 feet in that model. But aside from that, we're talking really just variations on a theme.
Yeah, everything's just going to fall within a ballpark, especially within the triplets, but honestly amongst most of these vehicles in their size category. And this one is basically the largest of that bunch. And obviously the braking distance kind of lends itself towards that, but boy, does it have a punchy little powertrain.
Yeah, I'd say that the engine really excels in overtaking. The 0 to 60 time, it feels a little sluggish from a launch, but once it gets going, there's definitely a lot of power and importantly a lot of torque to help get something this big up and going. But also GM does a really good job designing a front wheel drive suspension, and this is no different. Just the amount of grip, the amount of polish that we find here, it's definitely above average.
Yeah, and it feels very point and shoot versus, again, a lot of the other stuff you can buy in this category. We've got three rows at the house right now at your place that we were testing all week. And this one was by far the most interesting to drive.
Yeah, it's not going to drive like the rear wheel drive entries, of which there are still 3 in this segment, but only the Explorer sells in larger volumes, and it's nowhere near as big as this. I mean, it is significantly smaller inside, completely different kind of character.
And those sales volumes are based on the current Explorer, which hasn't changed too drastically. Mm-hmm. This is a big departure from the last versions of what we're calling the triplets, because it got a lot bigger. So in the next couple of years, you might see those numbers change around a bit.
Yeah, previously there was a time where the triplets were all about the same size. Then GM decided that they should have sort of a forked lineup, and they should have the Acadia be smaller than some of the others to compete with more with Highlander, and the Chevy bigger to compete with some of the bigger vehicles. And then they went, nah, that was stupid. Let's just make them all the same size again, and that's where we are now. But we are without that Cadillac XT6 that we mentioned before. So this really is the top dog in the lineup when it comes to handling ride quality and refinement.
Mm-hmm. And if you want more off-road capability, which you can still get in a crossover, you don't need a full body on frame SUV for, the Acadia does have an AT4 that gives you a little bit more in that direction.
The other place I think that the Buick suspension shines is on a rougher road like this. I think it's really well done as far as comfort goes, whether there are people in it or not, and that's an area where more traditional SUVs have sometimes suffered. The suspension in the back needs to be really firm to carry the kind of payload and towing ability that you'd find in a full-size SUV without adaptive dampers, and as a result the ride quality is not great. But in the Buick here, it's pretty comfortable.
I am happy to only have 5,000 pounds of towing capacity to have a much more comfortable ride. Mm-hmm. That is an easy one for me, maybe not for everyone. But
and a unibody with a fully independent suspension, it also just helps that out. I actually think that this rides a bit better than the Traverse we last had here, so I'm going to give this an A when it comes to the ride quality versus the B that we had in that Traverse. And no adaptive suspension system necessary. We just have a regular old steel spring suspension, which means lower maintenance costs longer term. There once was a time where one big differentiator between something like this and a Tahoe or a Suburban or an Escalade was the ride quality, possibly. But I will say GM's Magna Ride and air suspension combo in their full-size SUVs, that is really good. It's really expensive.
I would maybe like to see what it would feel like in one of these to see if it might be worth the extra cost, but cost it would come with.
Yes. Something like an adaptive damper setup could firm the ride up here a bit more if you wanted something sportier. It's not really, I guess, Buick's vibe, but it's probably not going to get a whole lot more comfortable than what we find here.
That would be more of a Cadillac thing, and there is no Cadillac version.
Now back out on the paved road, the one area where we get less refinement, I would say, than average is this engine note. And it's interesting. It's not just the sound of the 4-cylinder engine. It's that we get a lot of that coming in the cabin, and that is amplified, I would say, by the fact that the rest of the cabin is so quiet. It's a really quiet ride, very little road noise, but you floor it, you hear a lot of that 4-cylinder.
I almost wonder if it has to do with specific frequency, because this feels like it's winding up a lot higher pitch than you get in something like a V6, and the rest of your road noises tend to be at some lower frequencies. So it might be a frequency issue, but again, it stands out.
Yeah, I'm going to go with no. I'm going to guess it's probably just less sound deadening between the engine compartment and the passenger compartment, because you also hear those lower frequencies coming in there. That's sort of the grumbliness of this particular larger 4-cylinder. It's not the biggest 4-cylinder, but 2.5 liters is above average for a 4-cylinder in the US. So it does have a throatier sound, I guess you'd say, than a 2-liter in a Volkswagen Atlas or something like that. But it's the amount that you get in the cabin is somewhat surprising and at odds with the Buick logo.
And that's, I think, where there's maybe too much similar in the triplet lineup, where, okay, what's the standout on each end? And this looks the nicest, but it should be able to cash that check, right?
Yeah.
So it should feel the nicest by far. And yeah, I think it probably does ride a little bit better than the Traverse, but it should also be a little bit quieter inside. We should get a little bit less of that engine if that engine isn't giving us more power.
Right, and that's I would agree there. It's like if it's going to be the same engine, I just want to hear a whole lot less of it in here than in the others. And it's basically the same. The engine note inside is identical among the triplets, and also more engine noise than we get in Grand Highlander, than we get obviously in Tahoe or Suburban, but also Palisade, etc. Palisade isn't a pleasing V6 note, but you hear relatively little of it inside.
Honda's V6 is nice as well.
And you hear relatively little of it inside the Pilot in comparison. So that is like the one little chink in the armor here, I would say, is that engine noise. Fuel economy, it's been pretty consistent. We've averaged 21 miles per gallon. Last time we had the Traverse, it was 22.7 that we averaged over the week. I'd call that just driving cycle differences, season to season, etc. They're basically going to be the same since they're basically the same vehicle. The downside here is that there is no hybrid in this lineup, at least not in the United States. In China, General Motors does have some 3-row things with hybrids that they could have brought to the US, but they just have not.
No hybrids, no plug-in hybrids, and that is where I think they're going to end up not losing sales, but not staying as competitive. And if they had that tech in these cars right now, not only would they sell more of them, but I think more people would have seen them, right? Because instead of seeing a Highlander or a Grand Highlander, you might see a Traverse, Buick, Acadia, GMC, the whole thing. That's, I think, where they're going to be losing a little bit of traction. So my question is, how quickly can we get one into one of these vehicles? Because General Motors should be looking at it pretty seriously.
Yeah, the question I guess there really is does General Motors want to do it? But, we are seeing a pretty high sales percentage of Grand Highlanders as hybrids. We now have the new Palisade, which is going to be available as a hybrid, with room in both of those that are not too far off of this. Obviously, there are going to be trade-offs. They're still not as big inside, not as wide, not as long, not as roomy and flexible, but a lot closer than they were before.
The reason I haven't really mentioned the Cadillac XT6 up until now is that it's related to the previous generation Traverse, Enclave, and Acadia, not the current generation, and it's not getting replaced. Well, not directly. It's essentially being replaced by the all-electric 3-row Vistic. So the quartet has now dropped down to a trio. We have the Traverse as the entry-level model, I guess entry-level in air quotes there because there is a lot of pricing overlap here, but it does have the lowest starting price of $42,695. The Acadia goes up to $45,595 and gets close to the Enclave's top-end pricing, and then Enclave starts the highest, but it has the most standard equipment on it at $48,095. The important thing to remember, of course, is that these three vehicles are all almost exactly the same size on the inside. Only fractions of an inch separate them from one another. But they do span quite a large range, which is why the competitive set for this trio is kind of tricky. Obviously, we have the Hyundai Palisade, one of the newer entries in this segment. definitely right there in line with the pricing on the Chevy Traverse. And size-wise on the inside, it gets pretty close as well. We have the Grand Highlander and the Lexus TX, which we also have to talk about together because it's spanning kind of the same distance between those models there. And then, of course, you could cross-shop these against some of the smaller entries in the segment like a Highlander, a Pilot Explorer, or even a Jeep Grand Cherokee L. The Grand Cherokee L is long on the outside, but not long on the inside because, of course, the hood was designed for the inline 6-engine family and the V8s to live under there, and there's just a lot of hood going on, not a lot of inside. Since I'm treating the General Motors triplets as if they were just one model of SUV spanning from $42,695 on up to $69,535, let's do the same thing with the Grand Highlander and the Lexus TX, because honestly, there is just about as much difference between the Lexus and the Toyota as there is the Buick and the Chevy. We get different infotainment screens, sort of. We get some slightly different drivetrains, but there's a lot of commonality here as well. The base engine is shared. The Hybrid Max drivetrain is shared between the two. Lexus calls that the 500H drivetrain, essentially. And then the Grand Highlander gets the regular Toyota hybrid system, whereas the TX gets the plug-in hybrid system based on a previous generation Lexus hybrid with a V6. In fact, if you want a V6 in your Toyota or your Lexus, well, these Lexuses, the TX is the only way to go, and you have to get the plug-in hybrid system because that's the only model with a V6. It's not just GM that's decided to engine downsize and go with a turbocharged engine. The big thing to remember with the Grand Highlander and Lexus TX is that they're not as wide as the GM triplets here. And the difference is really noticeable in the third row. You will notice a bit in the first row, a bit in the second row, but back there in the third row, the rear bench is over 3 inches wider. That's really what gives them the ability to be more comfortable in the third row for 3 people across the back. 3 inches actually makes quite a bit of difference back there, especially if you're trying to mix child seats and adults or just more adult-sized people, I guess you could say, for lack of a better word. The rear bench is also higher off the ground, making it more comfortable for adults. And that's part of why when you look at the numbers on paper, it doesn't tell the complete story about third row comfort. The third row in the GM vehicles is definitely bigger and more comfortable. Now on the downside, you don't have the ability to move that third row forward like you do in the Grand Highlander, which can be really handy for larger cargo items. Now on the subject of the numbers and legroom, etc., it would appear on paper that the Grand Highlander and TX are really roomy. But when you actually get these in person, you will notice there is actually less real-world room between the seat backs in the Grand Highlander than in an Acadia or a Traverse Enclave, etc. And that's just due to the seating position in the vehicles and the way that legroom is actually measured. I take deep dives into that in other videos. The long and short of it is, with the seats more or less in the same position, you will notice that there's actually more room between seat back to seat back, which is critical for your knees, of course, and child seats alike, and just getting around the vehicle in the GM vehicles versus the Toyota or the Lexus. Next up, we have the Hyundai Palisade, which I think is a really, really welcome entry in this segment because it grew an awful lot, but its price tag did not grow. And that kind of surprised me because it is less expensive than the Grand Highlander, and I think it's positioned incredibly well. It's also a lot less expensive than the Acadia or, of course, the Enclave when you're talking about the upper end trims. Without the hybrid system, the Palisade tops out under $60,000. With the hybrid system, it tops out just over $61,000. So that is definitely well below the top end price of the Acadia and the Enclave. Although, interestingly, the Acadia can have real wood trim, and I forgot to mention this with the Lexus, but oddly, the Lexus does not have real wood trim, something Lexus has been long known for, but it's the GMC that offers that particular luxury touch. Now, as far as interior design and interior quality goes, I think actually the Palisade competes very well with the Acadia. I think the fit and finish is better in the Hyundai than it is in the Acadia, but some of the materials in the Acadia are actually a little bit better here. And I do love the style of the Enclave. I think they did a really good job just with the interior style, the dashboard, the seats, etc. The Palisade has a V6 engine, so if you're really, really into regular naturally aspirated V6s and traditional automatics, that's a good way to go. Just know that it's not terribly swift, and that is one of the surprising things. We have not driven the Palisade Hybrid yet, but by the time you watch this video, we may have, so stay tuned. But that is probably going to be the quickest model 0 to 60. 0 to 60 acceleration in the Palisade is actually quite leisurely, and that's my one bone to pick with that particular model. Now, we really just have to stop dancing around it and start talking about the triplets a little bit more directly. Logically, the big differentiator here is styling, because they drive alike, they use the same engine, they use the same transmission. There really is not a world of difference in terms of road isolation or especially engine isolation from the cabin. They all have that gruff engine sound in the cabin. The only key differences here are that the Z71 on the Chevy side and the AT4 on the GMC side offer the twin clutch axle unit in the back that offers torque vectoring and limited slip functionality. And we don't find that on the Buick for some reason. I'm kind of surprised by that. I wouldn't mind seeing maybe a sporty model of the Buick that used that exact same twin clutch unit to different effect, because it does have the ability to generate a little bit of yaw in the rear, make it feel a little bit more like an Acura MDX. We haven't talked too much about the MDX. It's important to remember that the MDX is quite a bit smaller than these vehicles, especially in the third row. It's just a completely different category of vehicle. But when we're talking about handling ability, it does have Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system, which interestingly functions actually quite like the twin clutch unit in the Z71 and the AT4. The software is the same between these vehicles. The handling capability is the same if we're talking about the same tire size and tire compound, because there's no change to the suspension. Everything is very, very similar. And again, fractions of an inch separate one interior from the other. And that's really just down to the styling and different layout of features and functions and what's standard and what's not. The bigger difference is in the screen setup. Obviously, dashboard styling is different, but the screens are quite different as well, because they went in different directions. In the Chevy, we have the same sort of instrument cluster and big touchscreen that we find in the Blazer EV, for instance. It's a huge 17.7-inch touchscreen LCD in the middle and an 11-inch instrument cluster. That is an absolutely enormous screen. Now, if you live in an area where it gets dark a lot and there's not a lot of street lighting, etc., so not a lot of light pollution, you might find that screen a little on the big side, because it is a traditional LCD. And the backlight means that at night, even when that screen is black, it's going to appear quite bright, because that's how backlights work. So keep that part in mind. Although I do love the fact that Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, that is absolutely huge on that display. It's really convenient. I think the software is also well done. I like the Google integration, the Google mapping, etc. The two-screen CarPlay and Android Auto setup, all really nice. I also like the setup in the GMC. I think it's a bit better integrated into the dashboard, a little bit less, aftermarket tacked on looking, because instead of the landscape display, it has a portrait display. And I think portrait displays work well when they're this big. It's not a little one. It's not like a Volvo with that tiny little screen. This is a 15-inch big display, portrait style, and CarPlay and Android Auto both work really well in portrait orientations. I've come to decide that I actually prefer CarPlay, oddly enough, in that portrait orientation, just due to the way things are laid out and how, with the big screen, sometimes that option can be quite far away that you might want to poke at. The smallest implementation of smartphone projection is the screen on paper that's the biggest. It's the one in the Enclave. It's a 30-inch display. I'm not clear how they're measuring that, because honestly, when we measured it, I could only come up to maybe about 25 inches, 24 inches. It appears to really have the same kind of screen real estate that we find in so many vehicles out there that are using the twin 12-inch display across the dash. We do have those sort of Daymedna glass wings on each side. Not overly useful, because most applications won't actually use the corners of that display. CarPlay and Android Auto certainly will not, which is why CarPlay and Android Auto operate in a much smaller little window. I like the look. It's really sleek. It's really long. It's definitely different, but I think I prefer the setup in the GMC. Price-wise, these three models are also incredibly similar if we're talking about similar feature content. So by the time you've identically configured the Buick, the GMC, and the Chevy, they're quite close, although the Buick does get a little bit more expensive and the GMC just tiny hair more expensive than the Chevy. When it comes to discounts, though, by the time you've actually walked off the dealer lot, you're probably paying basically the same price for any of these options, as long as they're comparably equipped. Just remember that you cannot equip them comparably on the upper end models. So if you want real wood trim, you will find that only in the GMC, oddly, not in the Buick. If you want the better leather, etc., you're going to find that in the GMC and in the Buick. If you want more of that monochromatic theme, you're going to find that definitely in the Chevy and the Traverse. But I do like the lighter colors and different colors that we find in the various different models in the GMC and the Buick side of things. Now, if I were shopping in this segment, I have to admit, I probably would get a Palisade hybrid based on the fuel economy. I like the style. The interior is very comfortable. It's big and roomy. Not as big as this Trio, though, obviously, but still big and roomy. And the hybrid is really quite efficient. Again, stay tuned for that drive. On the other hand, the Acadia has a lot going for it, and if I were shopping between the 3 GM SUVs, I would definitely put the Acadia on my shopping list. I like the interior and the exterior both, and I think it's a really, really tough competitor to the Palisade because it's so roomy back there in the third row. This is one of the few vehicles, well, these 3 are some of the few vehicles that could honest to goodness replace a minivan for a lot of people. Not everybody, admittedly, but I think a lot of people actually that maybe are tiptoeing towards minivan land might do well to steer towards the GMC or the Buick dealer. Just give them a check out and see if you actually need that extra level of room that you find behind the third row in the average minivan. See all of you next week.